helping people cope with and overcome life's challenges. This is Life Transformations with Michael Hart, certified Christian counselor and director of Ottawa's Elim Counselling Services.
Hi, I am Michael Hart, director of Elim Counselling Service, a Christian counseling ministry in Ottawa. I want to thank you for listening to this edition of Life Transformation, a Christian counseling radio show where chains are broken and lives are renewed. If you are not familiar with Elim Counseling, you can learn more about us at elimcounselingministry.com. Elim provides professional counseling from a Christian perspective for individuals, couples, and families. With me in studio today is Amy Porteous. Amy will be sharing her remarkable story of how God used counseling to get her through severe depression. Welcome, Amy. It's a pleasure having you here today.
Thanks, Michael. I'm very happy to be here.
Amy, why don't you start by giving the listeners some background information about yourself?
Happy to do so. So I'm in my 30s, and I have grown up in a Christian home my whole life. I've attended an evangelical church and have been a believer since my childhood. I literally was born in the church that I go to, and have always relied on God in all different kinds of situations. I have lived many situations early in my life that have impacted me and have helped me grow spiritually. And I'm married to a wonderful man of 5 years, and 2 years within our marriage, we were blessed with twins. And so I'm a happy mother as well.
Wonderful. So you're from a Christian background, grew up as a Christian, and everything in your life seemed to have been moving in the right direction until suddenly there were some changes that led to you coming to see me for counseling. Can you talk a little bit about the circumstances that led up to you coming in for counseling?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. 6 months after having my kids, I started experiencing some signs of postpartum depression. I really didn't realize the severity of what was happening until I got to a point where it was time for me to go back to work. And when I got back into my work setting, I returned into a whole new job with enhanced responsibilities in a completely new role, and it all became very overwhelming trying to balance work along with my responsibilities as a mom, and working in an environment where I had some challenges in terms of language. So I realized that I wasn't going to be able to balance this all on my own, and that there were factors that were happening in my body that I could not control. And so that really led me to coming to Elim Counseling for the first time, and also consulting with my medical professional, with my physician. And I with the combination of counseling and taking some medication, within weeks I started to begin to feel like myself again and find the joy that I had lost for so long.
Okay, so it seems as if you were going through a lot in your life at that time. Responsibilities as a mom, responsibilities at work, and a lot of changes that were taking place in your work environment as well. Talk a little bit about your physical and emotional state before starting counseling. What were you going through at that time?
Well, I had been quite balanced for a while, and taking my medications, and I had stopped going to counseling because things had seemed to regulate in my life. But I got to a point where my husband and I started having conversations about wanting to expand our family, and we had prayed about it. And before going on that step, one of the things I really wanted to do was become medication free. So under the consultation with my physician, I was medication-free about 4 months later, and everything was great. My life was great. I was happy and exuberant, enthusiastic. I had lots of challenges in my job, and my relationship with my husband was strong, and my kids were growing. But about 2 months after that, my life turned pretty quickly. And while taking a family holiday, my body started to revolt about with the withdrawal of the medication. And I entered the worst depression I have ever experienced. And it was this, at that point, that I had no choice but to go back to counseling and seek help, because I was really in a depth of despair where there was nothing that I could possibly do, and I needed some outside perspective.
Mm-hmm. So in the midst of a holiday, in the midst of having a wonderful time, suddenly you realized that your body was sending you signals that things weren't going well. And this led to you having difficulties sleeping, sleepless nights, and racing mind. Tell us a little bit more about those kind of symptoms as well that developed later on from that.
Right. So certainly I experienced a lot of physical and emotional challenges, and which was very different for me. I wasn't able to sleep through the night. If you knew me, I can actually sleep anywhere. I can sleep anywhere, anytime. So the fact that I was having trouble sleeping was a huge indicator for me. Mm-hmm. I didn't ever feel like getting out of bed. I didn't have that drive in the morning. I just felt unhappy. I knew I had so many things in my life to be happy about, and yet I was overwhelmed with this unhappiness. I had racing mind, and a lot of people ask me, what's racing mind? And essentially it was like my brain wouldn't turn off. It just kept going and going. And I got to the point where I even had started taking sleeping medication. That was the only way that I could force my brain to shut off. But even that was toxic to me. I had terrible headaches. And I was isolated, and I should have explained at the beginning, like I'm normally a happy and bubbly person and excited about life, and I have lots of friends, and when I hit this bout of depression, the last thing I wanted to do was be with people, and that was a huge factor as well. I was isolating myself because I just didn't want to expose to everybody else what I was going through. And it was so much of an effort to put up a facade that everything was okay. And I knew deep in my heart I couldn't anymore. Mm-hmm.
So there was a change in sleeping habits, change in the way your thoughts flow. You talked about having a racing mind, and also change in your personality. You went from being a very social person to being someone who tended to isolation. For those of us who are just joining us, I'm in studio here with Amy Porteous. My name is Michael Hart of Elim Counselling Service, and we're talking about Amy's sharing her story about how God took her from the depths of depression using counseling and other professional help. So thank you for joining us. So Amy, why don't you continue to tell me a little bit about what was it like the first time that you came in for counseling? Mm-hmm. What was that like, that very first time you stepped through the doors at Elim?
The first time I stepped through the doors at Elim, it was almost like a burden was being lifted off my shoulders. I was extremely relieved to have someone to talk to that was neutral, like a third party. It was very welcoming to me, because the people who I had confided in to date about what I was going through was my mom and my husband, and I felt like I was burdening them with something that they could not change, and it was characteristic of course when you're telling people about the depths of despair that you're going through, and they almost feel helpless. And so by going to counseling, it provided me this opportunity to talk to someone who, one, was a professional who was trained to be able to help me, and two, was completely neutral and outside of my circle. And I knew that whatever I was saying to you would be kept in confidence, and there was just it was a release for me to be able to talk and be prompted. I also purposefully went to Elim because of the faith component, because often you can go and you can seek help and get counseling, but for me the faith component was essential, and I knew that God was putting me through this for a reason. I knew that early on, even though it was very difficult for me to put together rational thoughts. I knew deep in my heart that God was going to see me through this, and that in order for me to do that, I needed to seek the proper counseling, and that it needed to be faith-based. And that that's really what our relationship has really evolved since then, and what counseling with Elim has been able to help me through.
Thank you very much for sharing that, Amy. I'm sure that there are listeners out there today who might be struggling with depression themselves. And I would like you to talk a little bit about some of the things that were really helpful for you during that time, things that helped you to overcome depression.
Well, certainly, depression isn't something that you talk about in every day. And going through counseling, I was able to really understand that depression is a condition that can happen to anybody, even those who are strong in their faith. Like I said at the beginning of the program, I've been a Christian my whole life, and I have been through tough circumstances, but this was just something in my brain that I could not change. And coming to counseling was helpful for me because it helped me realize that I'm not the only one struggling with this, and that, you know what, depression can happen to Christians, just like it could happen to non-Christians or to anybody. It also, counseling helped me to change the way I was thinking. I was catastrophizing everything. So whenever I had a thought, I always went to the absolute worst thing that could possibly happen. I'm going to lose my job. My husband doesn't love me. I'm not a good mom. And all these things that were negative thoughts that were not truths. But as soon as something would happen, I would go to the nth degree, the worst possible situation. And counseling and the use of a thought record sheet was able to help me gather my thoughts and prove against my feelings, to put aside my feelings and really focus on what the real reality was.
So that's one of the symptoms of depression, that you take a challenge and you magnify it to expect the very worst case scenario. And there was an example there when we did one of the thought records sheet where you were struggling with headaches at the time. Can you talk a little bit about how you viewed that struggle with headache? That is an example of how people catastrophize.
Yeah. Basically, the thought that I had was that I had severe headaches, and what I was able to do with the thought record sheet was write out what the issue was. And for me, it was that my headaches were never going to go away. And what the thought record sheet was able to do is I was able to put down the evidence supporting this, which there wasn't really a lot of evidence to support that, and then evidence contradicting it. And essentially, what I was able to do is identify that, I didn't have headaches all the time. There were certain periods during the course of the day where it was magnified or normalized. And then I realized through working through the sheet that, in fact, my problem wasn't all the time, that it was at particular times during the day, and that there was a repetition there. So, and by working through the exercise, I felt an immense relief by being able to take a thought where I figured I would have headaches for the rest of my life, to realizing that they were points in time.
So the Bible talks about taking thoughts captive. And this is exactly what the thought record sheet does, because you are able to slow down your thoughts by writing them out. In the beginning, you talked about having racing mind. Mm-hmm. So one of the strategies that we used in counseling with a thought record sheet was to help you write down what your thoughts were, mm-hmm. write down what kind of feelings you're having as a result of those thoughts, but then also write down, are there evidence to support the way that I am thinking? Mm-hmm. Is there evidence to show that I am never going to recover, for example, from the headache that you were having? Mm-hmm. And as you began to do that, you started realizing that your thought, the way you were thinking, was not rational.
Exactly. The thought record sheet was by far one of the most helpful tools, and since using it, I've been able to take that tool and share it even with some of my friends, just to work through basic things that they're going through. And so it was instrumental in my therapeutic recovery, but it's a tool that anybody can use in any situation.
That's fantastic. We're happy to hear that you're helping others by sharing with mm-hmm. them what you learned through therapy. As part of the therapy, we also looked at Bible passages that I thought could be helpful for you. There were a few passages we read in session that resulted in breakthrough moments. Can you talk a little bit about our use of the Bible and what was helpful for you from scriptures?
Absolutely. One thing going into the counseling, one of the priorities and goals that I'd set for myself was that I would read through the Bible, the complete Bible from front to back within 2 years. And so when I came back to the counseling, I had made it through about 3/4 of the Bible. And I really started diving into the Word to calm my thoughts and my heart, and I found that was a big part of my healing. And the Bible was able to confirm to me that there were many strong people in their faith that struggled. And that's part of being human, and it's about how we deal with situations. So there were two particular individuals that I was really able to associate with. The first was the story of David, and I found a lot of comfort reading the Psalms because I could relate to a lot of the passages that David wrote about in his depths of despair. And it was almost like I had written those words myself, and the pain that he was suffering. But what was helpful to realize is that in all the Psalms, at the beginning, he would explain what he was going through. But by the end, there was always hope, and there was always a reliance that God was going to be there and help him through, and there was always the light at the end of the tunnel. So for me, it showed me that this was also something that I was living, and it was a point in time, and that it would end, and that God would prevail. So that was extremely important to me. The second story that rang true was when God tested Job. He had lost everything. He lost his family. He lost his livelihood, even his friends. He had nothing. But through this whole thing, through his whole time, he still praised the Lord. And when I read Job's words saying his spirit is broken, I felt that my guilt and my shame was lifted, and strangely, that I was going to be okay. So those were two individuals within the Bible who were strong men of God who went through very difficult times, and I was able to relate to on both a spiritual and emotional
I think that's
basis.
very powerful what you have just shared, Amy, because what you're saying is that the Bible, first of all, helped you to realize that suffering is a natural part of human life, but also, secondly, that if you do struggle with feelings of depression, it doesn't mean that you're somehow lacking in your faith or you doesn't trust God, because David was a mighty man of God, so was Job, and yet both of these mighty men of God had instances in their lives when they struggled with depression. From the counseling, Amy, there were also specific things that you changed, very practical things, not just the spiritual, but there are practical things that you changed in your life that was helpful for you. Can you talk a little bit about what are some of the practical things that you changed?
Well, all in all, I think it was important to look at how I was living my life and prioritizing things, and I realized that I needed to be first and foremost taking care of myself, and there were many tangible things I could do to do that. So I actually ended up, through this process, I did have to take some time off work, and that was essential to my healing process. But it wasn't enough just to take the time off work. I ensured I was building exercise into my everyday routine. And even though it took everything out of me to be able to go and do some exercise, it also, by doing exercise, it helped to stimulate my brain and to help it function in the proper way. But it's not enough to get sleep and exercise, but also reading the Bible on a regular basis, like I said, and focusing in on some passages and praying, and those were key. And then I kept coming to counseling, and based on our therapeutic discussions, we were meeting on a very regular basis. 2 times a week, and that was essential for me to be able to voice and address the things that I was going through, and be able to make some strides forward. And last but not least, I did reintroduce medication slowly, and my aim is, hopefully I will be medication free, God willing. But at this point in time, that was something that I had to introduce. And one thing we didn't get to touch on before that I think is really important is that I had to come to a point in my life where I accepted that I had a mental illness, and that God chooses to heal you, may choose to heal you in certain ways, and that might not be how you think you should be healed. And I had to accept that, you know what, I might actually have to deal with this mental illness for the rest of my life, but I would need to find a way to be able to live and continue to survive. And the combination of these things has brought me out of this depth of despair, a point in my life where I didn't even want to live anymore, to a point where I know God has a purpose and a plan for my life. And if anything, going through this whole situation has shown me how much of how much pain people are living, how much, that we all have something in our life that we have to deal with. And the difficulty with mental illness is it's not like a broken arm or like a stroke. It's something that's a silent killer, because it's you can't see it.
And that's why a lot of people in Christian circles have a hard time understanding depression. Some of my clients tell me that they go to their churches when they're depressed, and they go to spiritual leaders and they're told, just have faith, snap out of it. But they can't, because it's a condition that they're not willing on themselves. It's a sickness, just as if you had your hand or your legs broken, and you can't just wish that your hand would or your legs would get better. So neither can you just snap out of mental illness.
And I think that that's a really important point, is that, I couldn't have prayed anymore. I couldn't have read my Bible anymore. There was actually a chemical imbalance in my brain that I needed a medical component and intervention, coupled with an ability to help my brain function properly, that was totally outside of my control. And once that was stabilized, then I was able to return to my normal self. And that was very difficult for people outside of my family who were believers to accept.
So there's a lot of stigma surrounding mental illness, and also in Christian circles we see that. So what made you decide to come on the show today and to share your story so publicly so that others can hear about this?
Well, first of all, I got an invitation, which helps. But I am a person that believes truly that everything happens for a reason. God knows every hair on our head. And I knew that God was putting me through this to share with others. And if my story helps anybody, then I know it was worth going through all of this. And I just know, by being somebody who's gone through it, that it's comforting to know that I wasn't the only person who was struggling with this, and that I was a good person, and that I was, had a lot of faith. And so what I've been able to do since is, in my job, I've been able to understand when some of my coworkers or even my staff have been going through mental health issues. I've been able to relate and empathize because I've been there. So that's been helpful. And now in my work environment, we're looking at having a wellness program. Also within our church, we're looking at strengthening our women's ministries and being able to help women address with some of these mental issues, and looking at having a conference for women. I also wanted to come on the show just so that I could share with other people that it is okay to talk about mental illness. People are living with this. The statistics are overwhelming. 1 in 4 people will deal with a depression in their life at some point. So it's a normal part of living, and it's critically important for people to get help. And just like all other sicknesses, it is silent. And so you need to be able to take that step of faith and get the help that you need. Because, had I not, I don't know where I would be today.
I'm so thankful, Amy, that you got the help that you need. And I'm sure that there is someone out there that's listening today that as a result of your testimony, you're sharing your experience, Amy, someone who probably wouldn't have looked for help is going to be looking for help and getting the help that is needed to help them get out of depression. So if you're just joining us, I'm in studio. My name is Michael Hart of Elim Counseling Service, and I'm here with Amy Porteous, and she has just shared a wonderful testimony of how God has used counseling and medication to take her out of depression and has now given her a new lease on life and a new vision of how she can help others who might be going through the same struggle. We have come to the end of today's broadcast. Thank you very much for joining us today, Amy, on Life Transformations and for sharing your story with us.
Thank you.
I'm sure your story is going to be a source of hope and encouragement for others. You have been listening to Amy's testimony of how God used counseling to help her. And she has covered a number of points today. And if I just briefly summarize, the first is that depression can happen to anyone and does not reflect a lack of trust in God. Secondly, God can use professionals to help you overcome depression in the same way that He uses a doctor to treat a broken hand. And thirdly, despite the hopelessness that you might be feeling today, there can be a bright future for you.
Amen.
If you're listening to this show today and you're struggling with depression or other issues, help is only a call away. 613-699-1677. Or contact us by email at mhart@elimcounselingministry.com. Stay tuned next week when Blaine Bender will share his uplifting story of how God changed him from being fearful and pessimistic to now having a positive and balanced outlook about life. Thank you very much for listening to this edition of Life Transformation, an Elim Counseling Service radio show. Until next time, this is your host, Michael Hart, praying that God would grant you happiness in all your relationships and keep you sound in mind and pure in heart. God bless you.